Alrighty, guys. Good afternoon. We'll start in about 5 minutes. Just give a bit more time for people to trickle in, and we'll get started. Just to let you guys know, we'll record this, and also we'll distribute the slides after the webinar, so you guys can share it with colleagues who can't attend. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to chuck that into the chat or the Q&A during the session, and we'll try our best to answer all the questions. All right, just to give you guys a bit of a background on why we're here today. There was an amendment that was released, I think, back in February, related to the Victoria Planning Scheme. I think Amendment VC 265. And the reason we're holding this webinar, we didn't find too much info out there, so we thought it might be a good opportunity to share what we have learned so far about the new amendment, and also how we can deal with it, how we can address it when we do future projects in Victoria. So we can think of this as more like a risk management, so to speak. Make sure we cover all our bases when we submit our applications. So we've got about 2 more minutes left. We'll just give a bit more time. All right, just another real quick reminder for those who just joined. If you have any questions during the presentation, just put your hands up or chuck it into the chat or the Q&A. We'll look at both towards the end of the session. And also, this session will be recorded, and the slides will be distributed to participants as well. So feel free to share with your colleagues. All right, let's get started. So today we'll look at the new flow targets that was introduced in VC 265. This slide will give us some context and about why we're here. So for February, that's about when the new amendment was introduced. If you're gonna look at your planning schemes all across Victoria, you kind of see in relevant clauses and a small update in terms of the documents that's being referenced. The new document has some flow targets, and this is where the question lies. Do we have to address it or not? We'll be looking into that today. And yeah, that's the question. Flow reduction on the planning scheme, but also where does the GED, risk pathway fit into all of this? And yeah, today we'll look at both pathways and let you guys know from our perspective how we would address these two pathways when we do our own projects, and it's up to you guys, to assess whether the risk is managed appropriately. Next slide, just a brief overview of what we'll cover. So details on the amendment, and then we'll look into the guideline itself, show you guys the text, what's being mentioned. Then we'll answer the important question, how do we address this? Look at it from a context of GED, so not only from a planning scheme perspective, but also the GED, and we'll do some modeling with tools and whatnot. So publication 1739.1, that's the EPA Urban Stormwater Management Guidance, which is a new document. It sets out performance objectives for the usual suspects, your TSS, your TP, nitrogen, and GPs, but there's also some flow volumes included. It also notes that on page 5 that the EPA document is not a compliance document, but it does contribute to the state of knowledge. And this line is important for the GED aspect, right? Guidance itself states it's not a compliant document, but the VC 265 now references this, so it's still open for debate. Does the status change to a compliant document or not? That's where clarification is needed. So looking at the performance objectives from the new document itself, we have your suspect, and importantly, the flow targets are based on two things: priority areas versus other areas. We'll talk about that later, and also your rainfall bands. So we see the targets vary depending on the rainfall band. Looking at this, it seems like for lower rainfall areas, you have a higher target. And for the priority areas, you also have a higher target versus non-priority areas. If we look into what the mechanisms for flow target reductions are, these definitions are directly from the EPA guidance document itself. So flow targets for evapotranspiration, we're looking for devices that allow water to be lost to the atmosphere via evaporation and transpiration. So these would relate to your vegetated assets, right? You got your bios, wetlands, tree pit swales, to name a few common ones. Harvesting, again, this is a big one in Victoria. Probably a lot of development, residentials, already have this in place, right? That's just your rainwater tank reuse. The more you can reuse on site, the more you can harvest to achieve your target. So laundry, toilet, and irrigation. You also have your large stormwater harvesting scheme. So maybe you have a precinct plan, or maybe an oval, and you're harvesting stormwater. That would help contribute to your harvesting targets on site. Infiltration, we got a lot of clays in Victoria, but some areas by the coast, your sandy areas, would be quite conducive for infiltration, right? So wherever you can have that, things like communal paving, infiltration trenches, or you can even have online bios where the council allows it. You can take advantage of those devices to contribute to the infiltration target. So looking at the first component on how to determine the targets, we have the priority versus non-priority areas. What's important is these areas here are obtained based on the Melbourne Water, healthy waterway strategy. So in the greater metro area, you'd be able to fetch this from the site and define the regions which are priority, which are these red shaded regions. So that's within the Greater Melbourne area. However, outside the Greater Melbourne area, the EPA document doesn't really have priority areas defined. However, there could potentially be priority areas outside of Greater Melbourne, right? So you have your things like your other catchment management authorities might consider certain areas to be priority. So it depends when you're developing outside of the Melbourne areas. But within Melbourne, typically you have this kind of nicely laid out bounds set out by Melbourne Water. Next, once you know whether you're in a priority or non-priority area, then you would have to look at the mean annual rainfall for your site. So typically you'd go to BOM for that data, or if you have a data source from somewhere else, as long as you can justify it. Typically we'll use BOM. To show you guys, we've actually built a tool to help out with this. And the workflow is pretty much the same, right? You have a tool, you get your priority areas from Melbourne Water, or you get a planning condition from your local authority. Maybe they say, you know, a nearby creek is considered priority, so you have to manage it on a priority target basis. But that's depending on planning condition. So layers from Melbourne Water indicates which regions are priority. So you have your areas in Little C somewhere here. Some regions are priority. City area, mostly not priority. So you'll be looking at the lower targets for infiltration. Once you know your development is, you know, maybe I have a development, let's say over here. All right, I know that I'm in a priority area. Next, I need to know my mean annual rainfall. So I'll go to BOM, or in this tool, it's automatically loaded for you, so you don't have to worry about going to BOM. It's roughly in that 600 band. The guidance says to round it to the nearest 100 mils. So that's what you do. And then based on this 600 rainfall band and priority area, I'm gonna get a 72 target for harvesting and evapotranspiration and infiltration at 9% of impervious flow. So that's two ways you can do it automatically through the tool, or you can just go to BOM, go to the Melbourne Water website, get both info, and you'll be able to fetch your targets, no problem. And that's once you have your targets set out, next step, you just have to compare the on-site flow reductions. So the sum of your harvested flows, your infiltrated flows, as well as your evapotranspirated flows, and compare them against the flow generated from impervious areas. So that's an important thing to note. Over here, you can see the example. I have my catchments, right? I got my roof to tanks. I got some mixed areas, so 30% impervious. In this case, I will only calculate the flows from the pervious areas. So that's a thing to note. So if you're modeling with mixed only, then you don't want to base the flow generation on the entire mixed catchment. You only want to base it on your impervious areas, impervious flow of that catchment, because that's what the targets are based on. So I have my catchments. I got my percentage impervious. I'm going to look at the node water balance if I'm doing it in music or JCO. And then I'm going to fetch only the impervious flows generated, and I'm going to sum it. So in this case, my entire site is generating 0.81 flow megaliters per year of impervious flows. Now, I'm going to sum up the flow reduction on each of my treatment devices. So in this case, I have an unlined bio with infiltration. So I don't have anything harvested from a bio. I've got some flows evapotranspirated from that bio, plants and everything. And I got the flows infiltrated. You can find this on the node water balance as well if you're using music or JCO. Same with the flows. Once I have these two components, I'm just gonna ratio them, right? So I have my impervious storm flows. Then I sum up my harvested flows and evapotranspirated flows, and I just compare them. So 0.16 ratioed against 0.8, I've roughly reduced the flow by 20.4%. My target is 29, so I'm, almost there. And I do the same thing for infiltration. So 0.46 of 0.8, that's 57. and I have essentially met my infiltration targets of 7% in this case. So that's how you would perform the assessment, whether you're a council or a practitioner doing the submission. So now the second I guess the second question is flow part of stormwater quality? In I guess to reframe the question, do we actually have to care about stormwater about the flows? So let's have a look at the wording, right? So in the planning scheme, clauses, your common clauses 56.07 require the designed stormwater system to meet current best practice performance objectives for stormwater quality. So the planning scheme mentions stormwater quality itself, doesn't mention anything about flow. The word quality then appears to limit the scope to pollutant reductions only. So you could argue that maybe we don't have to look at flow. But the EPA document itself, it does not clearly define what stormwater quality is. It recommends considering quality and quantity when we are looking at the potential risks and potential impact we have from stormwater runoff. And the EPA guidance also presents the pollutants and the flow volume objectives together in a single table. It doesn't clearly separate which is quality and quantity. There's no clear distinction between those two. There's also the reasonably practicable statement that we have to consider. So even let's assume that the flow targets do apply. Maybe it's part of your planning condition. Maybe the local council explicitly says that we want you to, as part of the planning permit, you also have to demonstrate how you've addressed the flows. When this happens, the reasonably practicable clause, this is a direct quote from the document itself, applies. And there is a whole EPA document online about what reasonably practicable means. But here is kind of what the gist of it is in terms of what we're doing for stormwater here. So we have to look at what controls are available, right? Suitable for the site. So, if I am in a clay heavy area where infiltration is not really permitted, or if council explicitly says no infiltration allowed, well, I can't really implement any infiltration then, right? So it is reasonably practicable for me to say I can't do infiltration, but I can still do harvesting because, rainwater tanks not really affected by the soil conditions, right? All you need to know is how much roof you have connected to your tanks, how much reuse do you have in terms of laundry, irrigation, and you can do harvesting. So in this case, it might be reasonably practicable to say I can't meet all the targets, but I can do my best to achieve harvesting targets while acknowledging that, I can't do infiltration due to either council restriction or maybe the engineering doesn't work out. Soils on my site, clay, can't do anything. If they're sandy, by the coast, maybe I can have some good infiltration there. So again, the cost of controls, right, relative to effectiveness. If it's clay and I do want to do infiltration, what is the cost? I have to, it's probably do the extra costs of controlling for infiltration into clay soils justify the relative benefit I get from that infiltration. But reasonably practicable is explicit for GED, your GED duties. So, and it's central to the guidance as well. Next, so having that in mind, we'll look at a couple of case studies a couple of examples, I should say, that we found online. You can have a look at the full. It's all public. You can have a look at the full case here. But essentially, in this case, the council was initially concerned in the stormwater management plan that the site failed to address EPA publication 17.39, which is the exact publication that has been now referenced in the guidelines. The council became comfortable after a frequent flow assessment was found to have hydrological impacts that would not be unreasonable, so reasonably practicable in play here. And the PSP was updated to acknowledge potential downstream impacts. So expert evidence per the discussion indicated that it was reasonably practicable and in accordance with EPA publication 1739.1. The outcome was, on the lots in that PSP, there was a mandatory 2 kiloliter rainwater tank per property with discretion for alternatives. But the key takeaway here is that EPA publication 1739.1 has been used by councils before as part of planning conditions, and there is indeed a need to demonstrate reasonably practicable efforts have been made to address the flow up to a reasonably practicable standard. Second case here, again, can view the full case, but essentially expert witness situation where they had to address stormwater volume storage based on the EPA document 1739.1, which is this document here. Again, reasonably practicable was used, acknowledging that the full target cannot be achieved, but the site has demonstrated they have implemented all possible controls. Expert mentions that the EPA document is not a compliance document in this case, but when the EPA was published the document, it was in 2021. But since now it's referenced in VC 265, does this change its status as a compliance document? We're not too sure. That's again the live question. Maybe if you have planning friends, have a quick chat with them. Yeah, we'll be interested to know what different councils think of this or how planning professionals think of this. Now, that's all in line with planning, but what about the GED and how it applies to this case? So it says that the GED assesses based on the state of knowledge, right? So under GED, the state of knowledge defines your obligations. And if we look further back up, initially we mentioned that the EPA guidance document itself states that this document contributes to state of knowledge. So definitely, whether we're in a planning application scenario or not, the GED does introduce some risk if we don't address the flow requirements. So just a quick overview, planning scheme, VC 265, example clauses, references to stormwater quality only, ambiguous whether flow is included or not. But under the GED track, because the EPA document does contribute to state of knowledge, we could open up ourselves to risk under the GED purview where it says flow targets are part of the EPA guidance. Have you actually considered the flow targets? Have you done what's reasonably practicable to address the flow targets? And if you have considered it, that's great. Maybe you're covered under GED. If not, you could potentially be open to some risk under the GED track, even though everything was good under the planning scheme track. So this is kind of what we think the process looks like. We're not practitioners, we're not lawyers, but this is for a professional risk context because we do projects ourselves. Moving forward, how do we make sure that we provide projects while covering our legal risk as well? So again, state of knowledge, reasonably practicable, and as long as we can justify and demonstrate that we have considered flows, it would cover us under that GED. Of course, it is up to each consultancy or each application whether they consider the risk or not, or what category you would consider the risk under. Is it low risk? Is it low risk to not address flow? Is it medium risk to not address flow? Is it very high risk to not address flow? And that varies depending on the project itself, maybe the council planning conditions as well. So that's just something to keep in mind on your next project. All right. So practical response case studies. So how would we do it if, let's say, we want to include this in our report? So what you do, find out your targets first. That's the most important thing, right? Get the rainfall bands from BOM. Get the areas. And then do your model in Music or .Code online. So you set up your model. So I've got something like this. JCO does it automatically. So when you click calculate and run the results, you would get the Victoria flow targets loaded up here. So it's already calculated it for you. And then when you get the report, you would have something that looks like this. Where is it? So something like this. So this is how we would structure our reports when we submit it to council. You guys have your own templates on, perhaps you can write your own section or template, but essentially you want to display the impervious flow because that's what the target is on. You want to show council how much you have reduced the flows by in harvesting, evapotranspiration, and infiltration. Then you want to let the authority or council know how much you have achieved versus the targets. So in this case, I have achieved 12% for harvesting and evapotranspiration. I have 29 for the target. So again, depending on what's reasonably practicable, that would be the test under the GED. Have I done all I can in this site? And the best I can do is 12.9. If that's the case, then perfect. And that's up to the authority or assessment to consider. If the authority or the assessment team thinks that 12% is not the best you can do, maybe you haven't considered this other option, then that would be up to discussion, either RFIs or a revisit of the planning conditions. And then just a couple of notes on the report as to what the flow targets mean, how to calculate it, and the detailed calculation as well. So you want to show the council, or council wants to look for the impervious areas, impervious flows, which are what the targets are based on. And then you want to have a sum total across all devices. You want to check to make sure all devices have been accounted for, and you want to make sure you have summed up the harvested values, evapotranspirated values, and infiltrated values. And then that's pretty much the reporting and results assessment. And again, if you're in music or JCO, you can find those values. Just right-click your node, view the node water balance, and in this roof area, for example, you can see that it gives you the impervious storm flow that has been generated. So that's what you want, because the targets are based on impervious flows. If I look at the mixed catchment, right, you'll see impervious storm flow 1.02, pervious storm flow as well 0.08. But the target's only based on your impervious storm flow. So this is the value I would take for my assessment. And again, if you right-click node water balance, you can view the ET losses in your bio. So that's what you want. You want to sum the infiltration loss as well, and the and reuse supply and reuse demand. So that would be in your rainwater tank here. So that's how you would find the values for the assessment. Going back to the slides, key takeaways. So we're at the end. This is pretty much the gist of it. We have a new amendment that was released in Feb, which introduces this new guidance document. Whether the flow targets are strictly required under the planning scheme, it's we're not really too sure. We've talked to some consultants, asked them whether councils have been asking for flow. They mentioned no, based on their projects, they haven't received any flow requirements. Ourselves, we've done a few, but there were no flow requirements requested from the council. But under the GED, so maybe the planning application can be tested under the GED, not just the planning scheme. And when tested under GED, then because the document contributes to state of knowledge, we feel as engineers ourselves that it opens us up to a risk of being tested under reasonable, practicable. Oh, that's such a hard combination of words to say. Reasonably practicable clause in the EPA document. So moving forward, feel like the best response to cover ourselves for both pathways, regardless of planning, to cover ourselves for the GED, is just to document or include some form of acknowledgement that the flow reductions do exist in the EPA document, because it's state of knowledge, and perform a quick calculation assessment to show the flows being generated, how much we have infiltrated, how much we've reduced it, and then maybe a quick 1 or 2 sentences as to, this is the best we can do. Clay soils, one of the easy ones to pick out. Clay soils, hard for infiltration. Reasonable to say that I can't really do much about infiltration, but I've done my best for rainwater tanks on this site, within practicable cost as well, right? I'm not going to put in 20 kiloliter rainwater tanks for each home just to meet the target of 48%, so reasonably practicable. That's the test. So the most prudent response, again, address your flow reductions in your SWMPs. You can create a short section on the flows, or just download our reports and you can attach it as an appendix because it's all automated in our reports as well. And yeah, that's what we feel as that's what we feel as professionals, how we should tackle this new interruption of the VC 265. So that would be the end of our quick session. Hopefully you guys have gotten something out of this, gotten some good info to help out with your future applications, or if you're a council officer, your future assessments, maybe considering certain sites to be more sensitive, etc. We'll open the floor now to questions. So we've got a few in the chat, but if you want to have any questions, just chuck your hand up or put something in the chat, and we'll get to it. So let's look at the first question up here. Let's see. Lucas says he saw in the IWN part of the update that they do specifically mention stormwater quantity there. Yep, that could be one pathway as well, where quantity is requested by the council as well. So integrated water management clause 19.03. If we look at it here, Lucas has just put that in chat. Ensure development protects and improves the health of water bodies, including creeks, rivers, wetlands, estuaries, and bays by minimizing stormwater quality and quantity-related impacts. So under 56.07, no quality, but if we look at under 19.03-3S, you do have a quantity requirement there. So that's a good thing to note as well. Thank you, Lucas. So there we go. Another compelling reason on the planning track as to why we should consider the flow targets, even though 56.07 does not explicitly say stormwater quantity. There we go. Thanks for that, Lucas. Let's see, next question. Do you typically have an ideal minimum % flow reduction target you aim to achieve to be considered as practicable on your end? This is, again, this is probably more something that councils would be able to. This is probably a project-dependent scenario here. The ideal percentage minimum depends on the planning condition and the project, right? If the project is located next to a very sensitive wetland versus a project that's located next to a very sensitive creek, wetland, creek, which one is more of a priority asset, so to speak? Which one do we value more? The answer would vary depending on your project location, right? If the creek or if the river is being used by locals, let's say recreationally, maybe that might have a more higher priority. Therefore, you want to have a higher minimum % in that scenario because human health. But on the other hand, if the wetland is, like a Ramsar wetland, right? You want to protect the local wildlife species and all that, and the creek is just creek not being used by humans, maybe then you would place a higher percentage a higher minimum on the flow reduction because it's a Ramsar wetland. So again, this depends really on the council's appetite for how much they would allow, and also the value of the asset or the value of the waterway that you're trying to protect. And yeah, there's no so far the documentation we've read, there's no ideal minimum. It seems to be more on the appetite for each assessing authority. And the same applies for the reasonably practicable, right? An authority might deem this to be reasonably practicable, but an authority all the way on this side might say, no, it's not, you can actually do more. So depends, I would say. But yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question, Harv. So I'm going to quickly look at questions. All right, seems we have those two questions over there. But yeah, pretty pretty straightforward in terms of the calculations, in terms of doing the assessment, how to determine if it has how to determine the site's performance against the targets. The tricky bit about all this is the legal aspect and the risk management aspect. As a professional engineer, RPH, with if you're having an RPH and all that, we have and the general environmental duty, we have a duty to do the right thing, the circle under the state of knowledge. And that's something that we should consider in our practices. So is there any more questions? Let me have a look. Q&A. Oh, no, nothing in the Q&A. All right. I think if that's the case, we can. Oh, I think we have another one from Find in chat. Are we seeing this amendment reflected in the Blue Factor online tool as yet? I'm not too sure. I haven't opened the Blue Factor tool, but I think in our last webinar, the results did show something with infiltration and flows, but yeah, we're not really too sure. We don't really use the Blue Factor tool. Yeah. But anyways, let's if it's not in the Blue Factor tool, you could still perform the calculation manually if the Blue Factor tool gives you information on the two things that we discussed, right? So if you can somehow find in the Blue Factor tool where is it? I'll show you. If you can somehow find in the Blue Factor tool where the impervious flow, the sum of all impervious flows, and also if the Blue Factor tool tells you the flows harvested, evapotranspirated, and infiltrated, then you can just print out your Blue Factor report, do the manual calculation here, right, on a separate Excel sheet, or and then generate the tables, and then either combine them into a single PDF, so you have your Blue Factor document, and then in the appendix you have your infiltration flows calculated. That could be one way to do it. Otherwise, if you have a look at the Blue Factor tool and it's already there, then that's all good. But this here, yeah, we'll distribute the PowerPoint. So if Blue Factor doesn't have it, you can. But if Blue Factor doesn't do the calculation explicitly, but you can find these values in the Blue Factor tool, then go for it. Next part of the question was this tool talks about, wait, let me see. I'll bring that chat up. Might be easier to have that so everyone has it. All right. Cool. All right, so that's the first part. Refactor in the Blue Factor. We're not too sure, but you can do the manual calc if the Blue Factor gives you info. This tool talks about deemed to compliance with only quality targets being required so far. Further to this, conflicting answers from council as to whether all targets will be adjusted. Yeah, that's the same situation we have as well. We've done a couple of projects. Councils I think councils are still not sure what to do with the flow targets. Which is, yeah, but until we do get further guidance from councils, it could potentially be that different councils, like we discussed, have different appetites as to what the targets should be. So it might be the case that certain councils want to have full score, certain councils are okay with the reasonably practicable score of maybe a minimum, or maybe it's assessed on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, we're not too sure on that from the council's end, but from a professional engineering point of view, we still have to cover ourselves for that GED track. So a quick statement in the report would go something like this or similar, right? We just mentioned, okay, how much I've done, and is it and justify it with a couple of lines about why it's reasonably, I've done everything that's reasonably practicable. Give council the info data, and we should be good from that end. Yeah, blue factor tool, I mean, you can still use it for you can, as we discussed, you can still use it for the quality targets. And then if that council says please consider the flow reductions as well, if the tool doesn't give you the flow reductions explicitly, then try and find that. Otherwise, use our tool to do that, because it's gonna give you the report, but you also be able to get you get the quality, and you also get the flow targets. Yeah. Also have a comment from Miha. It says the blue factor does not have the correct rainfalls. It's not appropriate to calculate infiltration. So the percentage reductions might be difficult to define in the blue factor tool itself. So that's another thing to consider as well. But yeah, long story short, if you want to use the blue factor tool, but you can't get the flow reduction targets, just try and do the manual calculation, or just go to our tools and you can get the flow pollutant reductions, but also the flow targets automatically calculated. Awesome. Anirudh, we saw you just joined. We're about to cover up, but what we'll do is we'll send all the participants the recording as well as the slides. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or give us a buzz. We're always always happy to help. So with that, we'll let you guys go. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you in the next one.